Is religious liberty endangered under the Biden administration? Former Solicitor General and author of the new book, Religious Liberty in Crisis, Ken Starr, will tell us. And will the guilty verdict in the Chauvin trial lead to reconciliation and healing? Attorney and pastor MARC LITTLE is here with some insights. Border states are insisting there is a state of emergency at the U.S.-Mexico border. Is the Biden administration doing enough? Former HHS Chief of Staff Brian Harrison is here with analysis. Pressure increases on the church to change her teaching on homosexuality. Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register, Edward PENTIN, reports. Finally, what are the pastoral challenges when prominent bishops and clergy lobby the Vatican to change teaching on sexual morality? President of the Acton Institute and parish priest, Father Robert Sirico, weighs in. The World Over begins right now.
Now, Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Ken Starr, Pastor MARC LITTLE, Brian Harrison, Ed PENTIN, and Father Robert Sirico are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Let's get started. As we read too often in the headlines, religious liberty is under attack in this country and around the world. How do we protect our religious freedoms from government overreach? What do we need to know in order to protect our tradition of religious liberty, and why is it important? Joining me now to discuss this and much more is the former Solicitor General of the United States, now author of a new book, Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty. Ken Starr joins us. Ken, first of all, thank you for being with us. Before we get to your book, I want to start with the story that's making headlines this week, the verdict in that Derek Chauvin trial. He was, as everyone knows, found guilty on all three charges. Following the verdict, President Joe Biden said this.
It was a murder in the full light of day, and it ripped the blinders off for the whole world to see. The systemic racism is a stain on our nation's soul. The knee on the neck of justice for Black Americans.
Now, even though racism never came up in the trial, Ken, your thoughts on framing this verdict in this way? Is this dangerous?
Of course, it's treacherous. Shame on the President of the United States. It was a time to, in fact, say our system of justice works. Where there's a serious allegation and charge, as there was here, of wrongdoing, of criminal wrongdoing, then that individual defendant has rights. And that includes the right to try his case or to be tried by a jury of his peers. The system worked and the system has spoken. To use this verdict by these jurors as an opportunity, as a platform for criticizing America is exactly the wrong thing in the wrong place. Shame on this president. He's, again, the great unifier. I can work with the other side. This is simply more division, causing rancor at a time when people should be saddened, but nonetheless reassured that the trial, from everything that we've seen, and we saw a lot of it, was in fact full and fair.
Prior to the verdict, Ken, while the jury was still deliberating, President Biden said he was praying the case would go the right way. And then Representative Maxine Waters of California said this in Minnesota.
I hope that we're going to get a verdict that say guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business.
So she said they need to get more confrontational. What impact, Ken, could this have on Chauvin's appeal, both the president's meddling here as well as Representative Maxine Waters?
Well, and the trial judge rightly said there's some concerns here as to what's happening outside. What Congresswoman, Chairwoman Waters was doing was calling for mob rule. This is horrible. Is there no shame, to coin a phrase? So they should all be roundly condemned by thoughtful jurists. They should be condemned, they being President Biden and Maxine Waters, by the American Bar Association. Where's the president of the American Bar, any other bar association? The Minneapolis Bar, for that example, the Minnesota Bar, saying, this is not our system. We believe here in ordered liberty, the rule of law, and you're calling exactly for the opposite. You're just calling for a result that you want. Have you been in the courtroom? Have you listened to all the evidence? No, you haven't. You've been out in the streets screaming. So I think it is utterly irresponsible for Maxine Waters to do what she did. I have doubts whether it will affect the appeal, but then again, let's wait and see what the lawyers do as they carefully assess the entire record.
I want to discuss your very timely book, Ken. You write about the great principles such as autonomy, equality, and accommodation that undergird our system of ordered liberty. How have these principles guided the court and our country when it comes to religious freedom?
The good news is for the last 40 years, even though the culture has radically shifted, to take a position of either, what shall I say, indifference toward religion, not involving oneself in a religious institution, not joining a church or a synagogue and the like. So while the membership lists are falling, the culture has been hardening in a sense of hostility toward religion. And the good news is, and what I want this book to do is for every citizen who cares about these issues to be equipped in the marketplace of ideas to say, you know what you are arguing now is totally inconsistent with what, I'm not a lawyer, the Supreme Court has held time and again in terms of freedom of conscience. Institutions cannot be required to perform abortions or to give notice of abortion clinics. That's the law of the land. And not infrequently, Raymond, the very good news is the court has been unanimous in sustaining these great principles of religious liberty. And these are great principles that every person should know. This is a book for citizens. It's not a book to go on law shelves.
Ken, in the last year during this pandemic, we have seen how religious liberties have been conscripted. You write, many state and local governing authorities significantly limited to outright banned worship services. As a result, church giving declined. In some places, the fall off in giving was so significant that the church staff had to be reduced. Living through the COVID lockdowns, we are vividly aware of the closure of houses of worship while other essential businesses are allowed to remain open. Why did we see so many state governments and lower courts, Ken, target houses of worship in ways that they didn't target businesses?
Yes, insufficient sensitivity to our constitutional order and our constitutional protections. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech. You know, the public officials like that. Governor Newsom likes freedom of speech, right? Governor Cuomo likes freedom of speech. But before you get to freedom of speech in the First Amendment, you get to the free exercise of religion. And at a minimum, that means being able to gather together in community, in a congregation, in a synagogue, and worshiping. And so I think it was a profound miscalculation on the part of governors. It, I think, is going to be viewed historically by fair-minded persons who are not anti-religion or hostile to religion. It's really a very dark stain on their orders. So how can, and here's an extreme example that made it to the Supreme Court of the United States, Caesar's Palace in Nevada can operate at 50% capacity, but no matter how large the sanctuary, the synagogue, the auditorium is, the fellowship hall, only 50 could gather in Nevada. The Supreme Court has had enough of that. It stepped in around Christmas time in time for Christmas celebrations, Advent celebrations, Hanukkah celebrations, and said enough already. Now, it wasn't unanimous, but still, all we needed 5 votes, and that's what we had in the church closing cases. The churches are now open.
You write that the sentiment behind the increasingly venomous attack on faith is not hard to discern. We can call it the harm principle, you write. That is, the views of millions of secularist Americans. Religion is now a bad thing. The Biden administration's been pushing this Equality Act, which would not only redefine sex and include sexual orientation and gender identity, but would do away with the Religious Restoration Act of 1993, removing conscience protections from religious persons and institutions. Is this the harm principle in action, Ken?
Yes, the harm principle means simply your exercise of religious liberty, church, individual, group, harms me. How does it harm me? It harms my dignity. Because if you, for example, do not bake a custom cake for my same-sex wedding, if you don't agree to provide music or other kinds of wedding services, you're inflicting harm on me. It's dignitary harm. I'm insulted, I'm hurt, I'm not treated as an equal member of the polity. That's the harm principle. And therefore, we've got to eliminate all these conscientious objections based upon what are being decried as atavistic attitudes and so forth. And yet, of course, as we know, all your viewers know, we're talking about traditions deeply rooted, not in some idiosyncratic faith, but in the faith communities for generations and indeed for millennia. And so in this country, we have historically, Raymond, as you know, protected freedom of conscience. The Equality Act would eradicate freedom of conscience as a reason to say, I can, in fact, perform this particular service, provide this. And now we're not talking about, and this is sometimes over-argued by our friends on the other side. Oh, you mean you have the right not to serve someone who, on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity? The answer is emphatically not. The poster child cases that of Jack Phillips, the custom masterpiece cake shop cake baker, who said, I serve everyone. I love everyone. From my faith perspective, I'm called to love everyone. I'm called to love my enemies or those who would claim to be my enemies, but I can't perform this particular act of artistry. And I hope in a pluralistic society that the majority of Americans will come to their senses, will first of all become informed. That's what's going on. Here is the fundamental point. Equality without exceptions wipes out religious-based objections, conscientious objections, which is a radical move for American law. I happen to think it would be unconstitutional to do so, but let's not have to reach that point. Let's say to the United States Senate, let's say to President Biden, if you care about this country and its traditions, inasmuch as you were an enthusiastic supporter of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, then you should say, cannot sign this in its present form. We've got to protect freedom of conscience.
Well, but just to your point, in January, a judge in North Dakota, Ken, sided with Catholic hospitals in striking down a 2016 Affordable Care Act transgender mandate. This would require doctors and hospitals to perform sex-changing surgeries with no regard for their religious or conscience objections. On Tuesday, the Biden administration appealed the ruling. Why do you think the Biden administration is appealing this, and why compel doctors and hospitals to violate their consciences?
This is the agenda, and the Biden administration is buying into the agenda, which again means freedom of conscience. We're just scuttling that, right? It doesn't count. And that again is a radical departure from our recent traditions. With Roe v. Wade, still the compromise was reached, the Hyde Amendment. All right, the Supreme Court has held by a deeply divided vote that there's a constitutional right to a pro-choice entirely choice abortion, but we're not going to fund it, period, full stop. And that was the view of members of Congress in both parties, but the culture has shifted very dramatically. No, we're going to fund abortions. We're going to require pro-life clinics to refer people to abortion clinics and so forth. The Supreme Court thus far has resisted these cultural shifts and has in fact been very strong in favor of freedom of conscience, freedom of association, right? And don't compel people to do that which they just can't in conscience do, absent the most compelling kinds of circumstances. And by the way, quick point, the Supreme Court even held that in the context of a for-profit corporation, Hobby Lobby.
Yep.
Those do not have to provide abortifacients. They had no objection to contraceptives, but there were 4 required methods of contraception plus by the Obama administration, and the Supreme Court sustained the conscientious objectors of.
But Ken, everything now hangs on the Supreme Court. I mean, it seems the ground is increasingly narrowing here for those who want to exercise their religious freedom and their conscience. And the Biden administration recently established a commission to study potential reforms to the Supreme Court, including whether the court should expand beyond 9 justices and whether to retain the lifetime appointment of judges. The idea of taking the number of justices to more than 9 has not been a popular idea among the justices themselves, including liberal icon Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She had this to say about court packing in 2019.
9 seems to be a good number, and it's been that way for a long time. I think that was a bad idea when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to pack the court.
Ken Starr, do you think Congress would approve adding more justices to the Supreme Court? Doesn't this politicize the High Court and tamper with a third branch of government?
Yes, it would terribly politicize it, and Ruth Ginsburg was so right. She put it very simply. It's a bad idea. Or then Senator Biden, boneheaded idea. So this is political entirely, because what we do know is that the Supreme Court operates at admirable efficiency. There's no huge backlog. It's not as if, oh, this is terrible, cases aren't getting decided. This is as bad as some, shall I say, third world country with years of backlog. There's no issue. There's no problem whatsoever. Now, there are some issues in the administration of justice, including the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. It's too large. It's been too large for too long, and they keep coming up, including in the church closure areas with boneheaded decisions. But that's the problem, not the Supreme Court. There's no problem. It ain't broke.
Yeah. In the opening chapter of your book, you write, if you know your rights, if you understand the constitutional constraints placed on government when it comes to religious liberty, you'll be ready to fight when the time is right. You'll know how and when to act when the next crisis comes calling, and make no mistake about it, the next crisis is coming. Now, we have seen everything from the Little Sisters of the Poor, seeming unending fight against contraceptive mandates, the houses of worship being closed during the pandemic. What do you see as the next crisis vis-a-vis religious liberty?
Actions of school boards. Be careful. If your children are in the public schools or your grandchildren are in the public schools, be watchful. The State Board of Education, and here's the good news once again, once we equip ourselves and not just have an opinion, we're entitled to that, but let's have principles from which to argue and to be able to say, I never went to law school, but I happen to know that there's a case that said, if you vote in favor of that, let's say excluding a Bible study club from campus, which is a recurring issue. I'm not a lawyer. I understand you're going to be subjected to the possibility of punitive damages, and you can't look to the school board for indemnification. It's actually true. Be careful what it is, school board members and school education board members. I use that just as an example. It may be the city council, as with Philadelphia, yanking the license of Catholic social services in Philadelphia to provide these precious children in the city of brotherly love with foster placement services. And why was the yank after over a century of providing these services faithfully and well? Because Catholic social services placement policies are consistent with Catholic social teaching, and no child would be placed in a non-traditional home. That was too much for the Philadelphia Inquirer and for the city authorities. Those city authorities, shame on them, because I'm very disappointed, frankly, that inner city Black pastors, and I'm just going to say it, African-American pastors, didn't organize and march on City Hall to say shame on you. But I'll tell you this, courage is needed right now. We need the courage of our convictions so that that grandparent who reads the book can say, you know, I'm going to call up my school board member and I'm going to have a preemptive cup of coffee with that person. And in a winsome way, said, by the way, I want you to know you may be under some pressure to adopt a policy or whatever, but here's the problem. It's called freedom of conscience, or one of the other great principles that I describe in the book, in a way by telling stories that everybody, including high school students, can find accessible and usable.
Ken Starr, thank you for being here. Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty by Ken Starr is available in bookstores everywhere and online. Ken, thanks again.
Thank you, Raymond.
Now that Derek Chauvin has been convicted of the murder of George Floyd, will this event lead to healing and unity? And what must be done now in order to bring all of America together? Please welcome back to the program attorney and executive director of Cure America Action, Pastor Mark Little. Thank you for being with us. President Biden and VP Kamala Harris have talked about this case as an illustration of what they call systemic racism in the country. After the verdict, Kamala Harris had this to say.
America has a long history of systemic racism. Black Americans, and Black men in particular, have been treated throughout the course of our history as less than human.
Now, Pastor, there's no doubt that the sin of slavery has tainted American and world history, I might add. But do you believe America suffers from systemic racism? And is this case an image of it?
Well, Raymond, thank you so much. It's good to be back with you. It saddens me to hear people in power speak that way. The reality is that this is not a racist country. We do not suffer from systemic racism, contrary to what the president and the vice president say. In fact, if there is systemic racism, President Biden was an architect of that. I would direct them to the inner cities of our country that are led by liberal Democrats. If there's systemic racism, they should look no further than the mayors, the city council people, and the police chiefs across America in these large cities that are run by Democrats. I think you can look, Raymond, very quickly across the landscape of America, and you can see that if you get up and you exercise your talent, you work hard, you have a family, you don't get pregnant before you get married. There are simple recipes to success, no matter your color. And the reality is that the left is simply using race as a dividing wedge. By the way, a wedge that they created so long ago. They've been fighting against unity in this country since the Civil Rights Amendments in the 1800s. And it's continuing today. It's a false narrative. All we have to do is open our eyes and look at the success of African Americans all around us. And it's a crying shame, because at the end of the day, all they're really doing is promoting a narrative to divide us, that they might continue to control the population for their own purposes. And their purposes clearly are for power. It's very sad.
Well, look, in this individual murder case, the charges against Chauvin were murder and manslaughter, and he was found guilty. How does it affect the community when these encounters between black citizens and white officers are constantly framed as racial incidents or systemically racist?
Well, it's very challenging, because what we have now is a justice system that has been turned into a system of retribution. The country cannot function that way. What we have to start doing is telling the truth. The truth is that there is no epidemic against unarmed black men. In 2019, there were 9, and that was upgraded to 13. In 2020, as of June anyway, there were 14. I've got to look at those updated numbers. But as of this year, there's 3 to 4 of fatal shootings of unarmed black people, black men and women. The narrative that we have a systemic racism problem as it relates to police is just false. What we're witnessing is the Marxist takeover, and they've got that in their crosshairs to dismantle and to defund the police. And by the way, 80% of the black community want more policing. Why? Because in our communities, unfortunately, we need more police. And so we've got to really speak up and tell people two things. When the police come to you and pull you over, you have got to not resist. You've got to put your hands on the steering wheel. And if you put your hands on the dash, point them upwards, palms up. And then the response is, yes, sir, and no, sir. It's amazing that Debbie Dingell actually agrees. We need to be teaching this across the schools of America. That's how we all go home alive. It's not complicated, Raymond. It's a simple formula as it relates to police and how to interact with them. If you have a gun and you have it when you're stopped, you may have a problem.
Right. Yeah, no, this is what I tell my boys who, they're both driving. First thing I tell, when the police comes, hand on the wheel, get out, hand on the car. You don't resist. You don't talk back. It's civility and common courtesy, and we'll sort it out. But don't create a crisis where none exists. Last year, you wrote that once the protests and riots died down in the wake of George Floyd's death, we would be left with the need to face race relations in America, and there will be a need for black pastors across denominations to play an active role in that process. What happens now, Pastor? What do we need to do now? Robert Woodson has pointed out that it is the collapse of the black family that plays a big role here. Your thoughts?
Bob Woodson is a great man. I admire him greatly. The church is under attack, Raymond, and it's not just race. Critical race theory has popped in and has taken over not only our education system, but it's now in the church, dividing us between oppressor and the oppressed. But we're facing a three-headed hydra that is coming against the order of God, and the church has to play a role. It's three-headed hydra. It's against the family, relating to marriage and fatherhood. It's against the church itself, shutting us down, and we're willingly bowing to it. And it's against justice, the actual order of our nation, vis-a-vis the justice system and even the Constitution. And so pastors, as I say, we have to stand up. One, we have to open our eyes. We can't be co-opted by the lie being used on the left that race is the issue and the problem. For the left, it's climate change and race. It's two cottage industries. These two things are about to destroy our nation. And so the church has to stand up. The leaders from the Pope on down have to rise up and speak against the divisive tool that the enemy has been using against us for so long. Acts 17:26 says that we were created from one blood. And then we have to act that way. We have to act out the commandment to love one another as we love ourselves. That has nothing to do with race, Raymond. And the church has to stand up and start speaking and acting out the gospel. We're not doing that.
Yeah. I want to play something for you. This is House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She had this to say about George Floyd's death earlier this week. Watch.
Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice. Because of you and because of thousands, millions of people around the world who came out for justice, your name will always be synonymous with justice.
What do you make of those comments, Pastor? And will removing immunity from police and giving the NAACP and the Urban League greater control over policing solve this crisis? That, incidentally, is what the George Floyd Act that the Speaker is pushing would accomplish.
Well, if you can get past the mask to take her seriously, it's a very troubling statement because I have to take it in context. It's not just Nancy Pelosi and the George Floyd Act. It's Chuck Schumer standing on the steps of the Supreme Court threatening the justices. It's Maxine Waters going into Minnesota demanding an outcome. It's mob rule, and that's what this is a part of. It's foolishness, and everyone knows that the NAACP and the Urban League, they had a role to play a long time ago. They've now been co-opted by a leftist agenda that's not doing black folks any good. What we have to do is do what you and I are doing right now, is giving voice to the foolishness. giving voice to the solutions, which we talked about a moment ago, and how we tell our children how to respond to police. That's the solution. Telling fathers that they have a role to play and that our communities need them. Daniel Patrick Moynihan talked about the destruction of the nuclear family back in 1965. We're witnessing that prophetic report that he gave to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Fathers have to get back into the homes and do their part. That's where the solutions are. It's not in turning anything over to organizations that have been anemic in our community for decades.
I know you've talked about the importance of prayer. How important is prayer at a time like this, Pastor?
Oh, Raymond, thank you so much for that question. Prayer it's a part of the solution. Prayer, I believe we have to begin with prayer. We have to, in this season, ask God for his mercy. Because what we are doing to what he created for us and what he created in the United States is being eroded. But here's the second part, Raymond. After we pray, after we get off of our knees, we actually have to use our feet. Because I believe we have to put feet to our faith. When we pray, that the narrative, the lies that are being spread, when we pray that the Lord would give clarity to the body of Christ, when we pray about that, we then have to get up and walk out that prayer by the power of the Holy Spirit, that we might impact the community as Matthew 5:13 talks about, being salt and light. And that what we actually are praying about, people will actually grab a hold of, which is actually the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Pastor Mark Little, a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for being here. We will check in with you in the days ahead.
Thank you, Raymond.
This week, the Biden administration ordered changes to the language used to describe people crossing the border into the U.S. Immigration agencies such as ICE will have to change their language, but what does this really mean? And why are they being mandated to do so now? With over 20,000 unaccompanied minors crossing into the U.S. since Biden took office, what is the reality along the border today? Joining me now to discuss this and much more is former Health and Human Services Chief of Staff under the Trump administration, Brian Harrison. Brian, I want to begin with these changes in language the Biden administration has put forth for Border Patrol and ICE. They will now refer to aliens as non-citizens or migrants. Illegal will become undocumented. Assimilation will be switched to civic integration. What do you make of these changes, and what effect does this have, if any?
Yeah, it's just a continuation of the Biden administration's longstanding attempt to sort of sugarcoat the problems that they are creating. I mean, how long are we into the Biden administration now? Multiple months with the crisis they have at the border. But you'll notice you're talking about some of the recent changes in terminology, but they have yet even to use the correct term, which is crisis. I mean, they won't say that. And so what they're doing here is they're simply creating these new terms for the illegal aliens that are coming here. They won't let us call them what they are. And they're doing it across the board, not just by not acknowledging it's a crisis on the border, but also renaming the facilities. I mean, if President Trump were still president, and if, when I was the chief of staff for him at HHS and we had oversaw these migrant shelters, they accused us in the media of running concentration camps. If you recall, it was kids in cages was almost 24/7 on the screens. And now you don't hardly ever see that from the mainstream media. They're renaming that too. Now they're reception sites or decompression zones. I mean, I oversaw these facilities. I've never heard these terms in my life. So I don't know what they're doing here.
Well, he who controls the language controls the story. More than 23,000 migrant children, Brian, are currently in government custody as of this week, and 10,500 plus sleeping on cots at convention centers and military bases. As you said, these welcome centers, I guess they're calling them now. Does HHS have the capacity to properly care for these children and the many that are still coming? Is the HHS equipped to handle a crisis of this magnitude?
Yeah, as the former chief of staff at HHS, I can tell you they are out of capacity. Absolutely not. And let's back up just a little bit and give some history here and some context.
Mm-hmm.
When President Trump was the president, and when the Trump administration, those of us were there, and we had a small migrant surge, we took the problem seriously. President Trump wanted that border secure. He took swift and decisive actions to solve the problem once and for all. He was building the wall. He had ended catch and release. He had to remain in Mexico. And then us at HHS, we used our public health authorities when COVID hit to say this is the worst possible time to have thousands of illegal immigrants carrying COVID-19 pouring our borders. So we put up Title 42 order that shut the border down coast to coast once and for all, allowed for immediate deportations, and kept the United States secure. All Joe Biden had to do was absolutely nothing when he took office, because President Trump left him the most secure border in our nation's history. And what you're talking about is all these shelters that are housing these illegal immigrants that are under 18, these 15, 16, 17-year-old teenage boys. The reason you're seeing that is because he didn't, when he came into office, President Biden, he didn't take down our Title 42 order. He left it in place, but he is illegally disregarding it. He's not adhering to it and not enforcing it for every illegal under 18. And that's what's causing the surge at the border, and why you're seeing these thousands and thousands of migrants in these shelters under 18, causing a public health crisis and a humanitarian crisis. It's totally inhumane what he's doing. It's illegal. It's why I filed suit against him in federal court about 3 or 4 weeks ago to force him to resecure the border. And in fact, I'll tell you this, when I left on my last day as President Trump's chief of staff at HHS, we had excess capacity in these facilities, and we had COVID protections in place to make sure there was sufficient spacing to make sure these sites didn't become what we're seeing now, which is super spreaders. So the media, the Democrats, they called the Trump administration inhumane on the border. They are the ones that are ending Trump-era COVID protections to make sure that we protect both American citizens and those who are in these shelters. And now they're building up new shelters by the day, thousands of new beds coming online, and they're creating COVID super spreader events right here in my backyard in Texas.
Wow. $60 million a week, we should add, in housing these young migrants. I mean, the price tag of this is simply unbelievable, to say nothing of the enormous humanitarian crisis and health crisis that we're seeing at the border. Last month, Biden tapped Vice President Harris to handle this border crisis. Now, she's expected to meet virtually with the president of Guatemala next week and travel to the Northern Triangle in June. What do you think she needs to do here? And is this simply an effort to reestablish the stay in Mexico policy that was already in place months ago?
You know, I could not believe it. I heard the other day President Biden talking about how he had tasked his vice president to work with Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries to see if they could handle the asylum claims in a very similar way to the way we had him in the Trump administration. And because this came right on the heels of him tearing up and trashing the Remain in Mexico and the safe third nation agreements that we had already set in place. So again, all he had to do was nothing. He scrapped our successes and is now trying to take credit for maybe thinking about starting to take some of the same actions that we had already taken in the Trump administration. And speaking of Vice President Harris, I mean, she's nominally in charge of the border. When is she going to go to the border and see what's going on? When are they going to let press cameras through there? That's another thing. The media and the Democrats always attacked the Trump administration and us at HHS for being not transparent. We were completely transparent. I can't even tell you how many reporters we sent through those facilities. I believe it was in the hundreds. I personally went to one of these facilities, migrant shelters at the border, with our fantastic First Lady, Melania Trump. And also, talking about Kamala Harris, it wasn't even, I don't think, 2 years ago, she was out literally protesting and picketing some of these facilities because she was upset over licensure issues. And now her boss, President Biden, and her are opening thousands and thousands and thousands of unlicensed beds. There is no limit to the hypocrisy here. And if it weren't so serious, it might be comical, but it's genuinely tragic. It's a humanitarian crisis. They created it. They did it on purpose, and they've got to be stopped.
Arizona's governor declared a state of emergency this week. He announced he's sending 250 National Guards to help local law enforcement with the crisis at the border. Should this be necessary? And are you surprised by the lack of coverage and outrage by what's happening in these border towns?
Well, I'm surprised by the lack of coverage and outrage by the media. But again, the media is just doing a massive cover up operation for the Democrats that control the White House and the House of Representatives right now. Border security is one of the few things that the Constitution clearly enumerates should be managed by the federal government. I'm a very small government person. I'm running for Congress to maximize individual liberty and freedom. But one of the few responsibilities the federal government has is to keep our borders secure. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are being completely derelict in their duties. And so the burden, unfortunately, is falling to some of these southern border states' governors who are having to step up and pick up the slack where the federal government, under the liberal Democrats with their open border policies, is failing America.
Brian, I only have a minute. I want to play this for you. This is former President George W. Bush talking about the need for immigration reform. Listen.
The system really needs to be reformed and fixed. Two things I think will help alleviate that. One is an asylum process that is more robust. In other words, the border is being overwhelmed right now, and there needs to be more judges and more courts so people can have a fair hearing. And secondly, we need to change the work visas.
Your thoughts on these comments?
Yeah, so I think that we, as the United States, we are a place where people who legitimately need to seek refuge should be able to come. And people who want to immigrate to the United States should be able to do so, but legally. But the problem is with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi and their open border policies, they are not allowing us to focus on what really should be our attention, which is setting an America First immigration policies, letting the right numbers of folks come here and for the right reasons. When you create a disaster, and that's what this is, it's a crisis, it's a national disaster completely of Joe Biden's making on the border, you refocus and unfortunately don't allow us to have the types of discussions we should be having about what should be the proper immigration policy for the United States, an immigration policy that benefits American citizens and American workers and the American economy, because we're right now completely distracted trying to put together and fix and solve a humanitarian crisis on our border that they created. Until we get the border secured, we're not ever going to be able to appropriately handle those types of issues that were raised in that clip.
Brian Harrison, thank you for being here and for your insight.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
And the controversy continues over the Vatican's recent prohibition of the blessing of same-sex unions, as does the increasing pressure on the Church to change her teaching on homosexuality. And it's Earth Day, and Pope Francis appeared before an international leaders summit on climate change. Joining me now to report on these stories and much more is the Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register, author of The Next Pope, Edward PENTIN. Ed, thanks for being here. I want to start with your report in the Register this week about the pressure that continues to be directed at the Pope to adjust church teaching on homosexuality, particularly this phrasing from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It reads, "Tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. They are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine affective and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved." Now, activists, including high-ranking bishops and cardinals, particularly from the German church, they have a problem with that phrase, intrinsically disordered. Pope Francis has already made a change in the catechism regarding the death penalty. What are you hearing about this in Rome, and how much momentum is behind this push?
Well, this has been going on for some time, Raymond, where they've been certain people in the church have been trying to change this wording in the catechism for different reasons. One of them is because they want to see the difference in church teaching. They want the same-sex relations to be normalized in the church. Others say there's a need to change it because there just needs to be less hurtful, as they say. And others who say, well, you can still have the same wording, but also, change the wording, but keep the teaching, and in fact make the teaching perhaps stronger through it. So there's different schools of thought, but I think the main movement here is coming from the German bishops particularly, but others too, who really want to normalize sexual relations within the church, normalize that sinful practice, and there's a certain momentum now going forward with this, and that seems to be quite prevalent.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, it's not just the Germans. I mean, you've got cardinals, Christoph Schönborn of Austria. He's the man who oversaw the editing of the Catechism, we should say, and Joseph Tobin here in the United States. And they're openly calling for a softening of this teaching. Are others making their voices heard in opposition, or is this basically the group we're talking about?
Yes, I mean, you hear it from different groups lower down the ranks, of course, but you have heard it for some time, and certainly in private, it's said a lot. I think this is what I've been hearing, but as you say, it goes from top to bottom, and there is a strengthening movement, I think, and being led by the German bishops. I spoke to Gabriela Kubi, who's a specialist in gender ideology and what she calls the sexual revolution, in the global sexual revolution in the church. And she said the German bishops are leading the way in making the church compatible with what she calls secular paganism. And this is just another example of that, according to her.
Well, here's the real question. Is the church listening? Is Pope Francis listening? I mean, there were some reports about activists calling him about the way the CDF stated this prohibition on blessing gay unions. And this individual indicated that Pope Francis was going to fix it. What does that mean?
Well, it's open to question. I mean, often Pope Francis will open these things to debate, and everyone wonders, well, why is that? Why is he doing that? But it seems to be because he wants, or at least allowing, the progressive side to move forward with this. And even though he will put out these statements from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, for example, saying no to same-sex unions, at the same time, not much else is done really to put a stop, if you like, to those forces within the church which are trying to push the teaching away from the magisterium. And I think that is the constant sort of way the Pope has approached this issue, as with many others.
Also this week, the U.S. State Department held a leaders' summit on climate. Pope Francis was originally scheduled to make an address at one time, then his name disappeared from the lineup, and then he popped up at the last moment, and he did issue a videotaped statement in Spanish, saying in part, "I greet you who are gathered in this initiative that seems to me a happy one, an initiative that sets us all on the path. All of humanity, through its leaders, our concern is to see that the environment is cleaner, healthier, and conserved, and to take care of nature so that it takes care of us." Ed, why was this statement delivered, first of all, later in the day? And was he always going to be a part of this summit?
Well, no, we only found out about that he was going to be a part of the summit later in this week. And in fact, only yesterday I was alerted to it. We don't know quite why, but it is Earth Day today. So it fell in very much with another message which he gave to commemorate that, to mark that day. So it all rather fits in with that. But again, you see, the Pope is very happy to talk about these issues. But the criticism here is that he will weigh in on these very secular concerns, but less so on others, which are perhaps politically incorrect or politically sensitive, particularly for the Vatican, such as China, for example, and things like this, where he's less keen to weigh in, but he will do so on those issues which get a good reception in the media and in politics.
No, I was surprised he didn't mention God or Jesus or the, care of nature, God commanding us to care for nature as part of that address. It was just kind of, a general, I'm glad you all are meeting, good on you. I mean, that was basically the message. Ed, you also wrote a piece this week on the Vatican's continuing silence on the human rights abuses in China, as you mentioned a moment ago, and the relationship between the Vatican and one of its longtime advisors, population control advocate, Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. Now, Sachs has been an apologist for communist China in the past. He had this to say recently on the BBC when asked about China's human rights abuses.
What about America's human rights abuses? The Iraq War, together with the UK, completely illegal and under false pretenses, not to mention the continued massive racism, white supremacism, and abuse of incarceration of hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S., Black, African-American people of color.
And in response to Sachs, human rights activist, Chinese human rights activist Teng Bao said this.
Every time when the United States criticizes the human rights abuse in China, the Chinese government said, look at your country and look at your racism. That look at in history you killed Indians, Native Americans. So that's a political whataboutism. That's really misleading. American. It's not detaining more than 1 million Uyghurs, not killing a whole people.
Ed, this is why the race narrative that we're hearing in the United States from some is so poisonous. It weakens America's ability to do good in the world and advocate for freedom abroad. How much influence, though, do you really think Jeffrey Sachs has at the Vatican? I mean, is it enough to stifle their reaction to China's human rights crimes?
Well, it's not clear. I mean, certainly he comes here a lot. Apparently he comes twice a month to the Vatican, and he's been to many conferences, and he's been here a long time. For over 10 years he's been coming here, and he certainly is listened to by the Vatican, certainly by certain parts of it, like the Pontifical Academy for Sciences, and other dicasteries, the dicastery for human development, for example. So he is listened to, and I think it's very interesting. The reason why I wrote that was because I thought it was interesting that the very similar approaches they have to China, particularly, and the reluctance to be in any way really critical of China's human rights abuses, and instead focus on the United States, for example, which, as Teng Bao says in the interview in that program, that they're not really equivalent. They're very different. Of course, the genocide against the Uyghurs, which the UK Parliament declared today, it is a genocide. That is not heard about. They don't really talk about that sort of thing, and including the Vatican is very silent on that because, as many believe, they don't want to interfere or jeopardize the agreements that they've made with Beijing. So there are similarities, and I think certainly Jeffrey Sachs is championed by, or rather praised or promoted by the media in China, the state-run media, and certainly seems to be on their side in many ways. So I think it's an interesting comparison, and I think some might think quite a disturbing one.
I'll say. We'll leave it there. Ed Pentin, thank you so much. And picking up on our conversation with Ed, what are the pastoral challenges that arise when dissent is carried out openly by high-ranking bishops and cardinals? And are radical changes to Catholic sexual morality even possible? To address this and much more, I'm joined by parish priest, a familiar face, and president of the Acton Institute, our friend Father Robert Sirico. Father, thank you for being with us. I just spoke with Ed Pentin about this push at the highest levels to change or at least soften the traditional teaching on homosexuality. I want to get your thoughts as a pastor on the challenges this creates for you and other parish priests when you have bishops and cardinals publicly on record saying they're embarrassed by recent church teachings, or Cardinal Joseph Tobin saying that some of the language used is very unfortunate. What are your thoughts on this vocal dissent we're hearing?
Well, it stands to set up a kind of dynamic where people will say, when you're trying to present the authentic teaching of the church, the 2,000-year teaching of the church, and longer than that in Western civilization, that they say, well, but the Cardinal so-and-so says this, and Cardinal so-and-so says that. Right. You know, especially in the area of homosexuality, it takes a lot for a person to surrender to this arduous cross, and to have it weakened in the name of making it easier when they're really denying people the opportunity to surrender everything to Christ. It's cheap grace, really.
Are we near a schism, do you think, as we saw in the Anglican Communion over this issue?
I think we are near another schism, given what's going on in Germany and the Holy See's response to that. I think this could become very serious, because the church isn't obviously not going to change its teaching. We can certainly express our ideas in different ways and certainly change our attitudes of acceptance and love and support of people. But we can't change the teaching because we didn't invent the teaching. We received the teaching. We're not in the business of creating a church. We're in the business of preserving a church.
Yeah, it's an important point that few make, particularly today. I want to get your reaction to something that was reported by Evita Duffy at the Federalist this week. Cardinal Blaise Cupich issued an order last weekend forbidding University of Chicago students from attending Mass on campus or anywhere else due to the COVID outbreak. Associate Director of Campus Ministry Matthew Moran wrote to students in an email telling them not to attend Masses at the school or any other parish because it would, quote, be risky and scandalous for those aware of the university restrictions. Now, Father, college students have a 99% COVID survivability rate. Aren't these restrictions a little harsh? And isn't the scandal advising students to skip Mass?
It is, and to just go beyond, just the chaplaincy, the nearby parish they can't even attend Mass at, I think it is highly imprudent. Now, a bishop has the right to interdict, in effect, a parish. This is a little different. This is telling students who could find a place to go to Mass, as I understand it, that they can't go to Mass in the vicinity. And I think it is imprudent and places the priests in a very difficult position because I have no doubt that those priests want to serve their people.
Yeah, no, it does put them in a trick bag. I mean, if they asked me what to do, I would tell them, but I better not. Before I let you go, I want to get your reaction to the
on this station.
Yeah. Before I let you go, I want to get your reaction to the sentencing last week of Catholic businessman, human rights activist Jimmy Lai to 14 months in prison for his role in pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong. I know you're a close friend and a confidant of Jimmy. What do you make of this decision by the Chinese authorities? And have you heard from Mr. Lai since he was sentenced?
Yes, I have not directly, but indirectly. He's asked me to write. I'm going to be beginning a correspondence, being supportive, and he's asked for some books. I'm suggesting Cardinal Van Tuan's prison journal and Cardinal Pell's prison journal, as well as the letters of St. Thomas More to his family. This was expected. This is the first, and there are more severe cases in the offing. My real fear is that they will transfer him to a prison in China. I think you have a Navalny situation here. I think really in many respects, Jimmy Lai is like a Solzhenitsyn. He's like a Mandela. This is a man who didn't have to be in the situation he's in. He's a billionaire. He has homes in various places. He has a British passport. He could have left. He could have taken his money out of Hong Kong. He stayed for the sake of the witness to the freedom of enterprise, to the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and he's paying the price now for it. It's an arduous cross that he now must bear.
Well, we ask our audience to pray for him and for all those who are being imprisoned.
Pray for his family, especially pray for his family and his dear wife, Teresa.
And are you surprised by how little in the way of support we're seeing for religious dissidents in China coming from this administration in the United States? Before I let you go, Father.
Well, never mind coming from this administration. What about coming from the Vatican? I think that in both cases, this is highly lamentable. I hope this administration will reconsider. You know, what's remarkable about Jimmy's case is that there is a lot of support among liberals. The New York Times has written repeatedly about the injustice of this. Organizations like PEN, which is an international organization of free speech advocates, and other groups, and even Nancy Pelosi has spoken out on his behalf. So I think more has to be done, and we have to give higher profile to these people.
I agree. Father Robert Sirico, we will leave it there. You can follow Father's work at the Acton Institute. They're at acton.org. Thank you, Father.
God bless.
On April 29th, next Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern, I'm going to be doing a virtual signing of The Thief Who Stole Heaven. A pair of independent bookstores, Anderson's and Twig bookstores, are hosting this virtual signing. You can order your signed copy and get a link to the live event next Thursday at discoverlegends.com or raymondarroyo.com. All the details are there. I'll be taking your questions. We'll have a grand old time. Again, go to raymondarroyo.com or discoverlegends.com for all the info on those signings. That is all the time we have for this week. Until next time, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Bye now.
Thank you.